read the call. Notice of a special meeting of the City Commission of the City of Brownsville. Pursuant to Chapter 551, Title 5 of the Texas Government Code, the Texas Open Meetings Act, notice is hereby given that the City Commission of the City of Brownsville, Texas, in accordance with Article 5, Section 12 of the Charter of said city, will convene a special meeting on July 5th, 2022 at 5 p.m. in the City Commission chambers located on the second floor of the Brownsville City Hall Old Federal Building located at 1001 East Elizabeth Street, Brownsville, Texas. Pursuant to Section 551.127, Texas Government Code, one or more commissioners or employees may attend this meeting remotely using video conferencing technology. The video and audio feed of the video conferencing equipment can be viewed and heard by the public at the address posted above as the location of the meeting. Members of the public, employees, and the City Commission may join via WebEx teleconference meeting by logging on at the link as provided on the agenda. Members of the public who submitted a public comment form will be permitted to offer public comments as provided by the agenda and as permitted by the presiding officer during the meeting. A recording of the meeting will be made and will be available to the public in accordance with the Open Meetings Act. At any time during the course of the posted meeting, the Brownsville City Commission may retire into executive session under Texas Government Code 551.071 to confer with legal counsel on any subject matter on this agenda, in which the duty of the attorney to the City Commission under Texas Disciplinary Rules of Professional Conduct of the State Bar of Texas clearly conflicts with Chapter 551 of the Texas Government Code. Further, at any time during this meeting, the City Commission may retire to deliberate on any subject slated for discussion at this meeting as may be permitted under one or more exceptions to the Texas Open Meetings Act set forth in Title 5, Subtitle A, Chapter 551, Subchapter D of the Texas Government Code. Mayor Pro Tem, we have Commissioner Galansky, Commissioner Cowan, Commissioner De Los Santos, Commissioner Cardenas, and Commissioner Tetro present. And we have Mayor Mendez joined virtually. You may call the meeting to order.
Thank you. Let's call the meeting to order.
The next item on the agenda is the invocation.
Let's all stand for the prayer and remain standing for the pledge. Father God, once again, we thank you for the many blessings we have in the city of Brownsville. Lord God, we specifically ask for wisdom today in how to navigate our quickly changing world, how to understand what is happening around us, and how to adjust even prior to those changes. Lord, we ask you to lead and guide our finance department today as we look at the budget, lead and guide our mayor, all of the commissioners, and give us each wisdom as to what would be best for the city of Brownsville. Lead and guide us in these future days. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. And now we'll have a short moment of silence where we can all add our prayers to what has already been spoken. Amen.
Pledge allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one indivisible.
Our next item is public comment period. We did not receive any public comment forms at this time.
All right.
Our next item is work session. Presentation on fiscal year 2023 budget workshop number 1, Financial Services Department.
Good evening, Mayor, Commissioners. Thank you for your time on an off meeting day. Hopefully you get your vacations done still. We will be presenting this collaboratively. It'll be the Financial Services Department, myself, and Mrs. Ramirez, who will tackle the first foray into the 2023 budget. I would just say to kick it off that The budget is a one-year plan, but you all have given us so much of your time through the Budget Committee and other efforts to take a longer-term approach at how we tackle things. And because of that, the budget, really represents an opportunity to further those longer-term objectives. So that's been our goal. You'll see familiar language, familiar concepts and methodologies and how we work within the funding streams. But that's the idea, that we're taking full advantage of the budget to move the needle in the right direction in pursuit of your vision, your objectives, and community needs. Next slide, please. We'll quickly recap the 2022 budget. We'll talk through the end-of-year projections and then introduce the guidelines that we've given to directors at the kickoff meeting that we had, and then dive just a bit deeper into that theme. Typically, the first meeting is very light, but because this year we have just a workshop dedicated to the budget, we did delve a little bit deeper than what we typically do in other years, where we just stay very high level for the first meeting. So next slide, please. For the 2022 budget, the key is that we're now fully under the Senate Bill 2 environment. Senate Bill 2, for the community's benefit, is the legislative bill that took effect in 2019, where cities are now fiscally limited in what they can allocate year over year toward maintenance and operations of our property tax rate. That is limited to 3.5%. There's also additional language that further limits the debt issuance side of the equation. We as a city experienced some of that last year, where because of the debt collections calculation, we almost forfeited 2 cents of our tax rate. We ended up using that tax rate for issuing additional debt in support of our 2022 capital budget, and that's how we were able to still maintain projects such as the cannery and others where we have a contingency fund. But it's just a reality, and that's why we've done 5-year planning, so that we can better adjust ourselves and scenario plan for the new normal. So Senate Bill 2 is here to stay. In 2022, we also maintained COVID-19 staffing levels. We did not fully staff up, and that was intentional. We wanted to preserve flexibility, considering that in the 2022 budget, we had a compensation analysis budgeted, so we wanted to preserve recurring funding availability so that if necessary, we could preserve that option. The major highlight, one of the 2 highlights, was from a recurring standpoint, we had a lot of technology maintenance to invest in. We had some contracts that came due where the warranties expired, and then we've also have added softwares to the city's menu of applications throughout the organization, and with those come ongoing maintenance and stuff like that. But that ultimately is a good thing because it expresses efficiency and productivity. A lot of our technology applications have helped us become more efficient, but there's also a carrying cost that comes with that. So we did invest $1.3 million toward ongoing technology maintenance softwares. And then one of the other highlights was our conservative budgeting and high sales tax produced, along with the PUB contribution because of the winter event, produced $16.8 million of surplus, which we used to accelerate investment in our deferred maintenance needs. Next slide. Here, Finance will cover these end-of-year projections.
Good afternoon. I'm Miguel Cavazos. I'm the budget officer for the city of Brownsville. So through conservative budgeting and through historic trends, we are projected to have an increase in revenues due to conservative budgeting for fiscal year 23. We won't know the actual revenues until the end of the fiscal year. So through May through September, we projected 9%. We're being conservative. And from March through April, collections had increase of more than 18% compared to budgeted. More than 8% compared to prior year's actuals. With last month's sales tax, we do anticipate to level out, which is why we projected a 9% increase on sales tax. For fees and services, the main source of the increase in fees and services is the ambulance fees. We have gone with other minor increases in parks and library due to COVID. For license and permits, an increase in building permits and processing fees have gone up. we went with a conservative budget last year. We were anticipating for this to decrease, but it didn't. The interest income did go up, so that's why we do see an increase there. And for non-property tax, we have an increase in bingo tax and mixed drinks. For expenses, we do, the main expenses we have are for personnel, and we do have 6% of variance there is because we do see vacancies. We have vacancies. So we see that, and the total expenditures, we do have a 4 point. Now, on the transfers out to other funds, we have 21 million is already reserved for non-reoccurring due to last year's surplus. So in the expenses, we have a 4.5 million in expenses. So with that said, we do have revenues of 126.5 million and expenditures of 114.3, which gives us a surplus of 12.2 million. These are other funds. We do anticipate, we have a landfill. We have the landfill contract, which will increase the revenues. For event center, we do have a multi-year rate increase that we're working on. And for motor vehicles, we do have a parking meter that will be drawn down, the parking stations.
Thank you, Miguel. Just to recap on the surplus for fiscal year 2022, you may, in the current year, we had 16.8. Now that had the PUB one-time allocation, but despite that, we still have a pretty sizable surplus projected for the end of fiscal year 2022 at 12.2 million. Miguel was mentioning that for the remaining part of the year, they're using 9% sales tax. Last year, you may recall, we used 5% through the end of the year to project out a sales tax number. Part of the reason why that number is a little bit higher is because we're still being conservative, but we want to be able to allocate more toward one-time projects up front in the beginning of the budget. Because this year, for example, at the mid-year point, we added a mid-year budget adjustment of around $2 million. So if we anticipate double-digit sales tax, we don't want to allocate that to recurring costs, but we do want to be able to have the ability to budget for more of that, so that more of that could go toward actual projects earlier in the fiscal year versus at the mid-year point. So that's really what that represents. We're not necessarily creating more exposure for us. It's just about programming the funding better, if that makes sense. The conservative budgeting is also coupled with sales tax increases that have stayed at the double-digit level, but in May, 82% of Texas cities began to see a decrease. So I think we're reverting back to the mean. There's been a lot of stimulus money and other things for us as well. What we're also studying more and calling attention to is that there's a lot of activity with SpaceX, there's a lot of activity with the port. That doesn't necessarily translate to our property tax base as much, but it does reflect in our sales taxes. So it's just understanding our profile and what it is that drives our sales tax. Miguel talked about staffing levels. We talked about maintaining pre-COVID levels. And then the surplus funding policy statement ultimately will govern how we come to you with ways to allocate that surplus. Any questions so far? Yes.
I think it's on. So the 500,000 in fees and services, what kinds of services, or just so that we know what's?
Yeah, what I would say offhand, we've seen an increase like at the court, and then also we are still seeing a pretty good number of single-family homes built. So those are all like one-time revenues, all those permit fees that we're seeing, main event, all that construction, they do pay permit fees, but a lot of that is kind of one-time money that we see in that line item. But I know court for sure, I think had over 300,000 alone. So it's kind of been a combination of permit activity and court driving that.
And then on the bridge, you had a 1.2 million decrease, but why is that? It went
Yeah,
down?
on the bridge, there we have a recurring commitment toward our fleet program, $600,000, and then $400,000 toward capital outlay. Last year, we we capped the transfer from the bridge to the general fund at 3.1 million. Last year, we talked about studying that fund balance because at some point, it's going to normalize where the bridge fund will be able to cash fund the fleet and the capital outlay fund both. In 2022, we still captured some of that lower revenue from the bridge because it wasn't fully operational throughout. So it is going to draw a bit on the fund balance, but that bridge fund has been pretty much earmarked specifically for the fleet and for capital outlay.
But the money did come in, it's just being diverted to other expenses?
Yeah, well, some of it was revenue that didn't come in at the prior, at the pre-COVID levels. And then some of that is we're going to continue to cash fund the fleet program and the capital outlay program. Drawing on the fund balance isn't the challenge. The issue there is just giving the fund time to really get a full year's worth of bridge revenues with its limited overhead, with a budget transfer to general fund, the fleet and the capital outlay programs all spoken for, so that we can make sure that we're replenishing it and not, drawing it down completely. So in the past, the bridge fund was a moving target where it was used to balance a general fund. Now we've committed it to cash funding, fleet, and capital outlay. We just want to make sure that we have a full year of revenues that are not limited by traffic being, reduced at the bridge. So going on to the 2023 budget, next slide, please. I'll finish my portion here in a bit. The guidelines for the directors are that we want to stay in alignment with the commission's strategic vision. That is a major priority as they develop their work plans. We need to fulfill commitments that are either entitlements, grants, things of that sort. We also want to continue the maintenance focus since we have still deferred maintenance to cover and the surplus lends itself well for that. Compensation, typically what you'll see in the next slide is we have had several or a few topics or initiatives that we want to accomplish every year. This next year, we've kind of zeroed in on compensation. Compensation is a challenge. The city has been challenged historically. It's not new, but that is the sole objective that we've told directors that we're trying to get a handle on from a recurring funding standpoint. And then also what we want to do is preserve flexibility. We still have, there's still looming concerns, even though we're kind of past the pandemic for the most part. There's still looming concerns of recession and things of that sort. So wherever we can insulate and lean on strategies that give us flexibility, we want to continue that. And most of that is built into the budget, but wherever we can continue that, we want to continue to make those types of investments. Next slide, please. Here's the theme for the next year. Last year, this was striking the balance, and we talked about taking that surplus money and recurring monies and allocating it between infrastructure and services, or within what we called our fiscal responsibility on the infrastructure side, and then the more recurring cost commitments. While we're not perfect by any means, and we still have infrastructure needs to cover, and I'll share that on the next slide, one of the things that we were discussing is we've done a lot to make headway on the infrastructure side of the equation, but looking at our service levels and compensation is one example of that, right? Staffing, compensations is still a multi-year proposition, but that is something that we need to lend attention to and make investments in. So for example, we've maintained vacancies during the pandemic. We know that there are service level needs that have been expressed by directors as we've put in the budgets. We shared that during the 5-year planning that there's about a $3 million set of recurring requests that we haven't been able to meet year over year. We have the landfill contract with Harlingen right now that's putting some pressure on the landfill. So they'll need to staff up, replace some equipment and stuff like that. But really compensation, which it doesn't necessarily mean that we'll be able to address everything, but making headway considering the inflationary environment and some of the cost increases is something that we have talked about as focusing as a team to make improvements toward. When you look at the fiscal responsibility side, we've made a lot of investment in streets. We've built systems that support the continued investment in infrastructure, and some of that will mature over time. But equally, we want to swing the pendulum to where the way we've been aggressive with infrastructure, we want to be as aggressive as we can toward continued recurring challenges, particularly staffing, compensation, and things of that sort. Next slide. This kind of paints the picture. Going back to when I was hired, a lot of the concerns that I heard from the commission at the time that was in the hiring brochure, a lot of that was infrastructure heavy, streets and drainage and things of the like. As I talked to the staff, there were more concerns about pay and things of that sort. But we've done things going back to the debt restructuring, to a lot of things that we've done. But basically, what this slide shows is we have taken a huge chunk of, we've taken bites out of the elephant, so to speak. And whether you look at light to medium fleet, whereas before, this goes back to the bridge fund question, we did not have an ongoing fleet replacement fund. Now we do. We carry around $5 million of light to medium fleet. Previously, non-public safety fleet was around 12 to 18 years old. That's been fully replaced. If you look at our vehicles driving around town, they're in pristine condition on that enterprise program. That gives us a much better way of funding those over time. And we've allocated $600,000, and we're now fully on schedule. All non-public safety fleet is replaced. And we've done that over 3 years. That's a major win. That boosts morale. That goes a long way toward making the environment better for our staff. From a heavy fleet perspective, that isn't accounted for in the fleet replacement program, but through our CIP and through the infrastructure maintenance fund, we're making headway. We had around $20 million spoken for with a lot of that, a good portion of that, 20 years plus in age. We invested in $4 million last year, and we're going to propose some additional investment this year. It's still deferred, but we're making headway. Streets and drainage, when we did the updated study, we had around $90 million of fair streets. We've taken $3 million off that list. That's mill and overlay, best ROI improvements that we're making on our street network. Drainage, same thing. This is a dated figure, but there was a $200 million list from the 2007 Drainage Master Plan, where we just invested $32 million that's in progress through the Water Development Board. So yeah, you have continued work on drainage, but it's a major, major investment. Capital outlay is your stuff that you don't want to have to use debt for at all, because it's smaller equipment type stuff. We used to roll that into our debt issuances at times. We have around $6 million of capital outlay throughout the organization. We're cash funding that at $400,000 a year. That's also going back to the bridge. That $1 million is going toward those two things. We set that up in fiscal year 20, and then last year, we accelerated 3 years worth of that through some of that surplus money, and now we're on schedule. We don't really have a lot of old capital outlay, and we'll continue perpetually keeping that up. Sidewalks, trails, alleys, the infrastructure maintenance fund was introduced in this fiscal year, 2022, and we haven't fully determined what the total cost of that is, but we did put one-time monies of $500,000, and the goal is to find additional recurring costs to put toward those public assets. And then there's facilities. I think this is the one that, kind of keeps me up at night a bit more, but we're making headway. The CIP will speak to funding the facilities because these are major costs, structural issues. The assessment should be done in August, and that will show us what the need is. Preliminarily, it'll be upwards of $50 million of needs. We've recommended that the broadband funding to be generated of $2.5 million be dedicated toward pay-as-you-go funding over time, and then in the current fiscal year, we put $4 million aside to get ahead of some of these facility needs. $2 million of that has been invested through internal services already for a variety of needs throughout. And you've seen that we've invested in the Children's Museum roof, the Civic Pavilion, the sports park. So there's been a continued investment in our facilities. But just to show you that going back to tilting the balance, are we where we need to be? No, but these systems are going to keep chipping away at these needs over time, and that was the plan. That's been the plan. And where we can, we want to accelerate that. So now the question is, how do we make headway also on the service level side? And next slide. I think Helen will take over from here.
Noel, can I ask you a question before we
Yes,
move on?
yes,
So in the column that says deferred or
Can you go back, please, on the-
completed,
yes.
does that mean you just set aside the money and, well, the work will actually be done later? Or are you chipping away at it in little pieces?
Yes, we're chipping away at it by budget year. So what we did here is when you have annual versus one-time, some of these funding streams are already annual funding streams that we've had on a recurring basis. Some of these have been one-time allocations. For example, the light to medium fleet, that's $600K that goes in through that bridge fund every year. So we're already going into year 4. And we've taken, again, everything's on schedule. If you look at our public works vehicles, public health, parks, all non-public safety, they're fully on schedule. And then we added the patrol cruisers, the PD cruisers. We used to issue debt for those. We just added them to this program. So we set aside $500,000 in the current budget, if you recall, to capitalize the transition, the equity buy-in into the fleet program. In the next year or two, this allocation will likely have to increase to support the ongoing costs for the cruisers. But the key here is we have a recurring revenue source that will keep that program whole. It was a 10-year program, and we're barely in the first half of that. Now, heavy fleet is different. Heavy fleet, we have replaced some of that through our debt issuances, but this current year, we allocated just over $4 million toward buying some of these street heavy equipment items in cash. So what that means is we need to keep chipping away at that either through debt or cash until we get on schedule. Is that helpful?
But then, yeah,
Go ahead.
I think, so like the $32 million, a lot of it came in with federal monies, right?
Actually, no, a lot of this is local monies. So when we issued our debt, if you recall, we leveraged the Texas Water Development Board monies. We leveraged like 14 million, 7 of that was 0% interest. So this is what we're talking about here. A lot of this is not even, this doesn't include ARPA. This is local money. This is our
So the
money.
32 million is separate from the Los Tomates reservoir?
Yes. Yeah, that 65 million, those are additional. So again, to your point, actually, we've added more water line, sewer line improvements for downtown. We added Los Tomates for drainage. That's another, I think, $15 million almost. The drainage at Tomates, what is that, 15 million?
11 something, I think.
Something like that. So yeah, that's separate from this. So we've actually accelerated and added more toward capital improvements through ARPA alone. This is just our CIP, bridge, and other one-time money.
So the reason why I'm getting at this is because as prices increase in inflation, does that mean that we're already locking in the performance and contract, or like prices for goods that we need?
Yes, most of these projects are, especially drainage, those are already planned and designed. They may not be in full construction yet. There is contingency built into these projects. Hopefully, we don't have to come back and do a lot to supplement them. It's to be determined. But a lot of that is already in play.
Okay.
The Southmost Water Plane Park, West Bronzeville, Sensors for the Sacas, Hope Park, all of that is in that chunk.
Okay,
Yep.
great, thank you.
So yeah, I mean, again, I think the story needs to be told. I know Communications is about to put out some information on the streets. That we added $1 million of cash funding. There's $1 million of CDBG, and then another $1 million from just our standard streets fee. So, I mean, $3 million for mill and overlay goes a long way. So if you drive around, the linear miles of streets being done through mill and overlay, it's pretty sizable. And the goal is, once we update all the heavy equipment, so once that heavy equipment is updated to where it won't take from the surplus cash, you know, I foresee being able to allocate $2, $3, $4, $5 million pops of street maintenance, and our street crew can do the work. They finished all the money, and they're on schedule. So it means they have capacity to do a lot of this mill and overlay in-house, contingent upon having good equipment that's not breaking down and all that stuff and the weather. But it's much better than the $700,000 that we allocate from the street fee. From the street fee, it generates $400,000, but after you account for staff and all the overhead, really only $700,000 of that goes toward materials that get laid on the streets. Yeah, so that's more than 100% increase. Again, it's a story to be told, and we'll be doing a lot of that through communications.
But the 3 million for mill and overlay is just what Public Works is going to do? That's separate from what has to be contracted out to the, when you reconstruction of streets?
Right, so that's a great question. So what we reconstruct, we don't do it in-house. That we contract out. So this doesn't include, so this is just fair streets, because what I'm showing here is like your maintenance, your pay-as-you-go maintenance. We do have streets that are in poor condition that need reconstruction. Those are debt-funded, so Old McAllen Road, remind me, Jose Marti, all those roads y'all just approved last meeting, that's all debt-funded, that's in the CIP. So at the third budget workshop, y'all go over your CIP. Out of the $10 million that we allocate per year, $4 million alone go toward reconstruction. Now, you
It
get.
all went to District 3 last week, at the last meeting, because that's.
But yeah, but I think overall they're pretty balanced. What you'll find is that there's been years where it looks like one district gets more than the other, but it's just like timing, because what they try to do is they try to mobilize as many projects in a geographically concentrated area to get a better return for the money. So they just kind of bundle the streets, but overall, everything has been equitably distributed. We made sure that every district gets the same allocation.
And it's also based on where the greatest need is in the city at the
Exactly.
time, regardless of district.
Correct. And then also from that perspective, CDBG money, for example, a lot of that goes toward 1 and 4 because the oldest streets that, and also the low to moderate income is in 1 and 4. So that's another example of where 3 doesn't really get much CDBG. So, but we try to account for all those variables and make sure that the money is spread evenly across. Yeah. And you all hold us accountable too, so you all typically see whether or not there's variation there, but staff does a great job and they have a spreadsheet and all that fancy stuff. All right. Next slide, please.
So next slide, we're talking about fiscal responsibility in terms of what we're seeing are additional recurring costs that we have to think of as we go into the budget year. The SAFER grant, about 1.2 million. Our collective bargaining agreements, workers' comp has also increased due to COVID. I mean, that's something that I think all communities in the United States have seen. The PUB transfer reduction. Now, in that case, we're not sure. We're still running the numbers, whether it's an impact or not. We capped the transfer at 9.9 million. So when it's over that, that may be able to compensate for that reduction and it may be a wash, but we're still going through those numbers. And also the IMF fund when we just went through recently. So chipping away at those needs that we have of infrastructure and maintenance. In terms of agility, what can we work with? The sales tax cap, so we have an increase in sales tax, and I'll go into the numbers of what that increase is, but really capping the transfer to 30% through a policy statement so that if it's volatile, it goes up and down, that we're still being conservative in how much of that we transfer to the general fund for recurring costs. We don't want to be in a situation where we're transferring too much and then in a bind in 3 years, and here we are trying to fund salaries with those types of, with an income stream that may go up or down depending on the economy that we face. The broadband fund, identifying as a new enterprise fund and how much that revenue can go towards infrastructure. Healthcare fund, what can we do through that subcommittee that we're going to have a meeting coming up soon to see where, if there can be savings, if the savings make sense at this time. So I think it's also analyzing that healthcare fund and what can we do now and what makes sense for our employees as well. And also, the compensation in terms of we want well-trained staff that is taken care of and has a good wage. And so we have to invest in that human capital, and that compensation study tells us, what are those flags that we've been looking at and what we should be looking at in terms of funding sustainably over the future. Next slide, please. So as we stated, we do have a one-time surplus funded, estimated at 12 million, continued healthy CIP capacity of 10 million. And, I always think of the CIP, the capital improvement program had historically, even prior to 2019, really just been for the airport and landfill. The fact that we finally have a CIP that is a 5-year planning document, with 5-year forecasting really puts us in a good situation as to what should we be allocating where. And it also becomes a transparent document to our community in terms of where does my street fit into the overall planning. In this case, what's been good this year is that we're going to be sending some information on what additional streets Engineering and Public Works has been able to, with their internal crew, also maintain. So we've gotten beyond the work plan. And I think that speaks to the workforce that we have and the equipment that we've allocated and the leadership, of course. We have a preliminary valuation increase of property tax of 7.75. And so that's new growth and existing growth. Now, at this point, we don't know how much of that increase is attributed to existing real estate properties and new. And that's really important because SB 2 caps the existing property. So that's going to be very important for us to understand how much of that money increased 7.575, which is great, how much of that is capped and how much is not. And so that will be something that we are working on those numbers, and hopefully finance will have that for us soon. Also, our sales tax, when the policy we're talking about, we're looking at a growth of 2.5% a year. Right now, we're not at the 30% policy cap that you all said in terms of using 30% of sales tax for recurring costs. We're at 29.5%. So that's something to look for in the future in terms of if we keep experiencing 7 to 8% growth in sales tax or 6%, whatever that is, do we exceed that 30% policy cap that we've created for recurring costs? So that's just something we're not there yet, but that's something to keep in mind with future budgets.
Helen, a quick note on that. To Helen's point, we're just under the self-imposed cap, I guess, if you want to call it a cap. It's a policy statement that we walked you all through as part of the 5-year plan. So we're still within that 30%, but that's a kind of a control mechanism to limit the volatility in general fund with regard to sales tax. But just as an observation that we were discussing is one of the drivers of why we still stayed within that 30% threshold, even though we allocated the full 2.5% that we've maintained over time, is that we have an almost 8% growth rate. So if we had a 2 to 3% growth rate, which is what was going on prior to 2018, we very easily could have potentially increased that, we could have superseded that 30% cap. So just want to call attention to that we stay within the cap overall in terms of the total percentage of sales tax as a revenue source for general fund, but we also have what Helen will cover in a bit, with a record year in growth. So 2-3% growth on the property tax side with the double-digit growth in sales tax that we're seeing. It doesn't take very long for sales tax to begin to take off. Just want to make that note also.
Next slide, please. So here we are, we have the numbers. The SAFER grant is 1.2 million. This is the 3rd year that we're into that grant match. Workers' compensation is approximately $500,000 increase a year. We're still working through the CBAs with police and fire, and also the compensation analysis. Staff has been working. We talk about train the trainer. It wasn't just a study that someone came in, did the study, and is leaving. Our actually OD and HR, our HR department, is actually doing the study. They're learning how to keep the study going, plugging in the numbers, classifying every single employee. So they've worked even this weekend because we want to make sure that we have those numbers early on prior to the adoption of the budget, is really looking at the classification of each employee. And I think they're halfway there. They were at 200 this weekend. So, we have about, over 400 classifications. So there's a lot of commitment and work, and really the professionals that really know what our employees do. I think it's giving them, taking it very seriously and really looking at what each employee does and what their role is at the city and how they should be compensated. And also, we talked about the 12 million non-recurring, which non-recurring could also be used as a one-time, performance payment or compensation payment as well. So, that's not to say that that all needs to go into infrastructure, although we have a whole list of different needs. But it's a combination of both when we look at compensation. Next slide. And I would also say that there's a lot of vacancies that we've seen year after year. So with some of the approach with regard to the compensation city is using the 1.2 million in vacancies to perhaps use that as a salary increase as well. So using all our tools in the toolbox to be able to meet that need and what the results of the study show. And here you can see the property tax growth outlook. The blue line is the 5.85. So you can see the taxable value, the growth of existing properties relative to new growth, which is at 1.90. What we hope to see is, the new growth increase, and we're working on that. I mean, you see just the redevelopment of the main event or the Hobby Lobby coming in, or GBIG's doing, the request for interest for the 729-acre business park with the World Trade Center. Those are the types that'll kind of help us balance our land use and balance our economy with respect to new growth. Because right now, all that, or the property isn't developed, it's almost, it was vacant or ag. So as you can see, we really need to increase and diversify our land use to get us where we need to go. Or else we'll continue to see this type of growth. Next slide. And here is just the pie charts on the left. As you can see, that heavily residential revenue, that much of the revenue is residential. Residential, it cannot pay for all the roads and the needs and services that we need in the city. Commercial's at 9%. We're trying to increase the industrial 5%. And you can see by the proportion of total cost for each land use, I mean, really half of the land use is either ag or vacant. But that also presents the opportunity to right-size our land uses, make sure that our growth, new growth is sustainable, and we can balance that because industrial, commercial will generate more revenues for a city versus residential. So it's that balance, striking the balance there as well.
Hey, Helen, just a note, and why it's important, I know you guys see this slide, and you probably think, why do you keep bringing this up? Well, I think it's critical, especially in light of a budget conversation, that this be brought up and as much times as we can. Because while on the prior graph, while SB2 is more overt and known, right? We run that 3.5% cap, that's more known. This is not as commonly known unless we're talking about it. And there are two forces, and this is a record growth rate. The prior, if you go back to the history of Brownsville, I don't think Brownsville, the prior year was the 6% of 2019. That was the first year of reappraisals. But what's important to note is there's two forces that are blunting the impact of the growth rate. The first one now is Senate Bill 2. You won't be able to use the full 5.85%, right? That's known. That's the new normal. That's the state putting handcuffs on cities. Secondly, it's the tax base. And the tax base, it works both ways. When you see your growth rate go up, if you don't see the tax revenue, robustness, it's because it's not the most efficient way of growing your revenue. So typically, when cities increase taxes, when you have a more predominant residential tax base, you're more calculated about increasing the property tax rate, because what increases the value of your cent or your penny is when you have a strong industrial commercial base. Otherwise, you're just putting it straight on rooftops. And that's why it works the same way with the growth rate. The growth rate could be 10%, but 10% of our tax base is not the same of 10% of a 50-50 or 60-40 tax base between industrial commercial. So you just don't have the same bite in the growth rate the same way that many cities think twice about adjusting the property tax rate. They prefer to do a fee. They prefer to leverage other forms of revenue generation because a property tax rate increase may not be the most tax efficient way. So here you're seeing it play out, though, through your growth rate.
Next slide. And here you can see the inflection point in 2021 where the blue Sales tax actuals are supersede the property tax actuals. So, you can see that growth, that spike in sales tax. And the question is, yes, that would allow for more non-recurring money, but we do definitely want to grow our recurring tax base that we're capped at. And
So,
next-
yeah, Helen, on this slide, if you look at the sales tax actuals for 2021, 36.6 versus budget versus the budget of 28, and then if you compare it to budget or actuals for property, the key here is the inflection point really was 2021. 2021 is a telltale year, and we brought this up to the Budget Committee, that effectively in 2021, sales tax became our leading indicator. If you look at the back-end ratio or the back-end percentage of our financial report, for 2021, 37 million and change of sales tax, 33 million and change of property tax. And we call it out because we can control that. And that's why you're seeing the surpluses. That's the connection that we need to make here. The fact that we are maintaining the 2.5% and now we're adding the 30% cap to supersede that. It gives us the ability to control the recurring expense commitment from sales tax, and you all are doing it prudently because it does two things. It limits volatility in general fund, which makes it much more harder to manage. As a city manager, you rather manage a fund, or you all would rather have a fund that is driven by more stable revenue versus a volatile source. And then secondly, you're less exposed to external market forces. A lot of things could disrupt sales tax that are beyond our control, and by doing that, you have that control. So it's very similar to our enterprise fund transfers. By capping those, we're not exposed to the bridge, we're not exposed to the electric fund or whatever could happen in Mexico. It doesn't apply as much. So we just want to call this out here because there's been a decision made very intentionally to convert the 2.5% conservative year-over-year allocation to a no more than 30%. So there's safety in that because it's going to give us this surplus type environment that we're in.
Next slide. Yeah, it's not to beat a dead horse, but here we are estimated through September 2022. Sales tax, we're looking at 41.6 million, estimated budgeted through March 33.5, and just the estimated variance over what we budgeted conservatively is 8 million and growing. So that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing, but then we wish we would have more stable or recurring funding growing. So we'll see what that is. Last slide. So as we continue our budget process key dates, here we are. Our next budget meeting will be July 19th. We're hoping to have more detailed information on the compensation study, just crunching those numbers and then going to you. And by then I believe we have our healthcare budget meeting. I want to say July 14th. That date stands up in my head, subcommittee meeting, so we can know more about where we're going in that direction with a target date of second reading for September 6th. So this would be our first of work sessions, and then we're aiming for our second and then third, and then our approval of the budget. And I know that BCIC and GBIG are also working on their budget. That would be presented to you prior to the overall adoption because you are the fiduciary responsibility of both the Economic Development Corporation. So you would see that coming to you as well.
I have a question, or rather a comment I'd like to make to staff. For the upcoming budget work sessions, I would like to see the packet of what is going to be presented to us when we get the agenda. I want to have time to look at it beforehand so that I've got my questions ready when we come into these sessions.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, just a comment. It'll be easier for the next one. Right now, we're dealing with preliminary values. That's why we typically, the first workshop, keep it very high level because we don't have a lot of meat to report. I know Helen wanted us to go into the meat because I may not be here for the next workshop. So she wanted to make me the meat, I guess. But I'll be the meatball. But yes, sir, because values come in July 24th, so everything kind of is weighted till the latter part of July. So we purposely went a little bit deeper just to peek more as to what we already know. So yeah, we will.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Do we need to acknowledge?
Yeah, I don't think there's any decisions. There's just acknowledgement. If you all have questions to Commissioner Dos Santos' point, you'll get flooded now with a lot of more detail and that kind of thing. But for now, we just wanted to get the first four-way out of the way.
No action.
No action, no action.
Okay, thank you. Next item.
Mayor Pro Tem, it is now 5:51. Would you like to make a motion to go into executive session?
I'll make the motion.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
For the record, the commission may consider the following items during executive session. Closed session pursuant to Texas Government Code, Section 551.071, consultation with attorney to discuss legal issues with city attorney related to Project Studio, City Manager's Office.
It will be, but I don't think it's all hooked up yet. Okay, let's go ahead. Yoli, we have 4. Now we have 5. Now we have 5.
Okay. Time is 6:13. There is no action on the item.
So we need a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
There being no further business to come before the commission, upon duly made motion, the meeting adjourned at 6:13.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, that was nice.